Hey, welcome back to Business 150, Introduction to Management. This is now our 7th video in this series in Module 8. And in this particular video, we're looking at something that, at least the first title, may catch you a little bit by scratching your head. What are we talking about here? You can see from the title slide, we're looking at latent structures. Latent or hidden or not so obvious structures. What is that? Well, it's really a way to contrast with the formal structures that we've been talking about, for instance, in the last video. Obviously, in video number 6, we talked about the actual departmentalization that appears in a formal printed organizational chart, for instance, the way that departments are formally set up. But we hope that at the end of this video, you'll be able to identify latent structure of the organization and how that's distinct and different from its formal structure. And then, of course, we also hope that you'll be able to specify the 3 characteristics that define the latent structure of the organization. Now, let's take a good hard look at this. What is a latent structure? The latent structure really is, well, what's the organization really like? Sure, I have the printout of the org chart. I have the printout in color and on a big old piece of paper, but what's the organization really feel like? What's it really like to work here? What's it really like to thrive here? What's it really like to have working relationships with the people here? In some senses, then, it's a outworking or a result of actual corporate culture in that sense, right? But we call it latent structure to identify it as something really distinct and different than the formal structure. So you see there, the first bullet point on the slide, formal organizational charts and diagrams show us the formal authority flow and such, but here's some questions. How rigid are the rules actually enforced in practice? How closely are written procedures actually adhered to? Who really makes the important decisions in real life, in real time, despite whatever perhaps the printed organizational chart would suggest and indicate? You see, the latent structure, what we describe here and in the text as the latent structure, describes what the organization is really like. And there are 3 primary characteristics which determine in actuality and practice the latent structure. You see them here. Number 1, the degree of actual centralization, the degree of actual complexity, and finally, what is the degree of formalization in the firm? So, first of all, centralization. We know that we talked about centralization a couple of videos ago from a formal sense, but really centralization describes an organization in which the entire decision-making process is concentrated in a relatively few high-level positions. And you know that from a formal perspective. That's how we defined it a couple of videos ago, right? But as you look at these 2 diagrams, what we're really trying to indicate is, in actual practice, who really makes the call in real time? Because that's really based upon, in a latent structure, how authority is actually realistically disseminated, right? You have the type of manager, the type of boss who will say, yeah, I know I'm supposed to sign off on it, but I'll tell you what, man, until that is formally changed, you just tell me what you want to do, and I give you permission to make the call on a daily basis. Now, hey, every month we're going to revisit that, but you keep making the right call, and I'll stay out of your way. And so what effectively you would have is actual decentralization, no matter what the formal org chart actually says, right? So that's just an example, but that's really what we're talking about. What is the actual real-time practical outworking of centralization or decentralization in the organization? And the second matter is simply a matter of actual complexity. Complexity describing the level of differentiation among structural units, including the specialization of jobs, geographical dispersion, and the size and the height of the firm, right? All of these things make some things far more complex than others, right? In other words, consider this. If you think about the ongoing debate in social media with the degree to which artificial intelligence imposes certain constraints and certain degrees of surveillance upon users of social media, that's not an easy thing to be able to rectify or to even to adjust, because so much of artificial intelligence is simply intertwined upon itself. That is a level of complexity which will have some consequences in terms of actual structural relationships between engineers, decision makers, what is possible and not possible to accomplish. That's just one example of large degrees of complexity having actual impact upon the latent structure that is set up, no matter what the reporting lines in a formal organizational chart would seem to indicate. And finally, the textbook suggests this third characteristic, the characteristic of formalization. Formalization referring to the degree to which the organization's procedures, rules, and quite frankly, even personnel requirements are written down and enforced. If you've ever been in a firm which hands you an employee manual that's a couple of inches thick, I've been there. I've been in a company where, when they finally hire you and give you your onboarding, they give you the employee manual, and that sucker is huge. It's 2 to 3 inches thick. If you ever work in a firm like that, the next question is, okay, you gave me the book because you have to. How much do we actually live by this book? How much are we allowed some latitude to be able to do some things or make a judgment call, or does everything go back to page 87 of this particular book? Well, that's what we're talking about, actual formalization. What's the degree to which those printed rules have to be enforced, and where's some latitude for us to make a call based on the context, the circumstances, and using common sense? Well, those three things together, the degree of formalization, the degree of complexity, and the degree of centralization or decentralization in the real world, all have to do with defining what's it really like to work here. No matter what the org chart says the formal structure is, what's the latent structure? And this gets into a discussion then of tall and flat organizations. A tall organization is an organization that if you look at the org chart, you see that there are many layers of management. And the span of management is relatively narrow. And remember, the span of management refers to how many employees a typical manager has to manage who report to him, right? So relatively narrow span and a very tall, many layers of management is known as a tall organization, whereas a flat organization has a relatively wider span and fewer layers hierarchically of vertical management layers. So let's see if we can describe this for you. Now, when we consider tall versus flat organizations, that in and of itself will also give us some indication of what the latent structure actually looks like, what life at the business is actually like. And you can sort of classify latent structures along this continuum of mechanistic to organic. And the idea here is at one end of the continuum, mechanistic organizations are highly formal, highly complex, and highly centralized, whereas at the far other end of the continuum, organic organizations can be described as less formal, relatively simple, and decentralized. And the idea is, of course, a real organization is probably going to be somewhere on this continuum rather than at one of the polar extremes. And the whole suggestion of considering the latent structure of an organization somewhere on this continuum between mechanistic and organic is to suggest that, as it says there in that previous slide, the happy medium is really where an organization is likely to thrive when both the formal and the latent structures are in harmony. When you have, for instance, a relatively decentralized formal structure complemented by actually informal, more organic latent structure. Or, in some industries, a tall organization formally being accompanied with a relatively mechanistic latent structure. So more on this in the textbook. We would introduce these ideas that no matter what you've got in an org chart, you do also have the actual day-to-day life and how things are really done in terms of the distribution of authority and responsibility, centralization, complexity, formality, and formalism. These are the kinds of things that really do contribute and determine to life at an actual organization. Therefore, we hope that after this consideration, this brief video, as well as your contemplation of this topic in the textbook, you will be able to identify how the latent structure of an organization is distinct from its formal structure, as well as how those three characteristics we've described, right? The complexity, the centralization, and the formality of the organization being those three things that really define the latent structure of an organization versus its formal. Again, hope this is helpful as you think through this topic of organization. We've got one last video to go. We'll see you there.